Welcome to the Wheeler Centre, and thanks for coming to this week's instalment of the Text in the City series, where we invite a super brain along to give you tips ahead of your exams coming up at the end of the year. This is a great series, not just for you guys, but for all of us, because it allows us to really look at some of the texts that are on the VCE list and look behind them and ask why they're there and why they're important to us all as a community. My name's Ruby Murray, and this week we're going to be talking about the gore-bespeared world of The Year of Wonders by Australian author and Pulitzer Prize winner Geraldine Brooks. Please turn off or turn your mobile phones on silent at the moment, or you'll incur the wrath of the literary gods, which I'm sure you're all aware by now are fairly disgusting and pus-filled. How many of you have actually read the book? Wow, congratulations getting it done this early in the year, that's great. Well, to talk about the book today with us, we have the wonderful local novelist Toni Jordan, author of Edition and Fall Girl, whose work appears in newspapers and magazines across the nation as well. Toni has a book coming out in September this year and is also going to Beijing to spend 3 months as a writer-in-residence at the Peking University over the summer. So at the end of the session, we are going to ask you guys to bring your questions to Toni, and this is a great chance for you to get some of those questions in and really get an outside view on the book. So do start thinking about them now, and we'll open up for them in about half an hour after we've had a chat. But to start off, Toni, I just wanted to welcome you here and ask you, when you first read the novel, what did it mean to you as a piece of fiction? Like, how did you approach it, and what were your reactions?
Thanks, Ruby. Hello, everybody. I had not read Year of Wonders before I was asked to for this session. I read March, and another book of Geraldine Brooks's, which I loved, and I read People of the Book, her third book, which I did not love quite so much. So I was quite torn and a bit nervous reading this, but I just thought it was awesome for so many reasons. I know the difficulty when you have to study a novel, you have to pull it apart, you have to try and, reason your way into it, and I know that can damage the enjoyment that you get from reading a book. I know exactly what that's like, but this is really a fantastic example of storytelling and the craft of writing. So I know you've all read it with one eye to future assignments, but I hope there was a little bit of you that was enjoying this experience as you went along.
We were saying before we came out how we actually remember the books that we both did in senior years as well, and that part of like doing these projects with books is sort of building a relationship with them that you're going to carry on down through the years. Mm-hmm. What sort of a relationship would you have to this book, do you think? Do you find it as a work of fiction? What I'm exactly trying to ask here. How would you approach it if you were going to pull it apart? What would the most fundamental parts be to start tearing it?
Well, there's a few things that really caught my eye about it. Of course, the most obvious is that it's historical fiction. So that combination of those two words means it's set in a very distinct period. It's set in the world of 1665 in one particular town in London, in England. But at the same time, it's clearly a work of fiction with invented characters. So that, in the first instance, creates a bit of a minefield for the reader trying to pull it apart with a view to studying it, because it's very tempting to start figuring out which bits are the real part, which bits are the historical research, and I'm convinced there's heaps in there, and which bits are the fictional elements. So immediately there's a tussle between those two parts of the fiction writer. Which bits are genuine research really happened, as far as we can know what happened in 1665, and which bits are clearly invented. And I was especially thinking a lot about that in terms of the language, because the language in this book is beautiful, beautiful. And because it's a first-person narrator, from the very first page, I used to love this season, the wood stacked by the door, the tang of its sap still speaking in the forest, the hay made all golden in the low afternoon light. I mean, this is later than the time of Shakespeare, yet you don't see, there's no evidence of that kind of complexity of language here. So Geraldine Brooks has had this difficult task of making a book that sounds beautiful and charming to the modern ear, yet retains sort of an olden day feel to it, so that we can identify it as not of today.
Thematically, I guess Geraldine Brooks has one quote that is sort of widely put around on the internet, and I think it might be in one of the reading guides in some editions too, where she talks about writing historical fiction after September 11. And she was asked about this, and she talks about the murders in the States of a Muslim and a Sikh. And says that, I have imagined this same instinct to turn on and blame the other in the lynching of the Gaudis. Love, hate, fear, the desire to live and to see your children live. Are these things different on a beautiful autumn morning on a 21st century city, in a 21st century city than they were in an isolated 17th century village? I don't think so. One thing I believe completely is that the human heart remains the human heart, no matter how our material circumstances change as we move together through time. And I wanted to ask you, like, what do you feel comes away from the novel about the human heart? Like, what are the themes that are modern in this? And do you think that she's right? Is the human heart when you're writing historical fiction? Or has she sort of, for you, pushed ideas onto these people?
Look, this is a really important question, and it speaks as well as the point I made about the language, about making something accessible, but it also is about what you have here is a group of people under incredible fear and stress. And not even fear and stress as we understand it in modern terms, because they don't know even what's causing this. And they consider it to be something sent from the gods, from God at times, rather than something, at least the fear and stress that we have of modern times, we have a better idea where it's coming from. So you have this, the actions of these people under stress, I don't know, are all that different. If you look at the way people are behaving in here to the actions of the way people behaved in the early days of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, I don't know if there's that much of a different response. So yes, in that respect, people are people, and whether they're in 1665 dealing with the plague or, you know, in modern times dealing with our stresses, there is a tendency to turn on people who are not quite the same as everybody else. The other side of your argument, of course, is that for someone living in this time, Anna Frith is centuries ahead of her time. Not only has she just about figured out through her skills as a shepherd and her skills in animal husbandry that it's probably likely that this is just a part of nature, this disease, rather than a judgment of God. But she's the only one in the village who can see that it's not the Gaudis' fault. She seems to be the only right-thinking person in the whole place. So there's two things going on here. There's the similarity of people over time, and then there's this modern sensibility thrust on this single person, which is kind of a novelistic device so that you can see more clearly the way the other people are behaving. I mean, if everybody behaved the same, you wouldn't get such a vivid view of it.
I was just thinking, there's actually a movement in England at the moment called the New Elizabethans, which is trying to work out who the famous Elizabethans of this Elizabethan age with the modern queen are going to be. Right. And trying to do that thing is like you can tell while you're living in a culture what the most important cultural outputs are going to be. And there's been a lot of debate going on about women in this new Elizabethan age and whether or not you should be choosing women, and if you're choosing them to make up for the fact that you know now that you're supposed to be gender equity, but maybe women don't actually still have the same cultural place, so we're sort of constructing before the fact. I mean, that comes up again when we're looking at this age as well, like how believable is Anna as a woman, or is Geraldine Brooks sort of constructing what she wishes history had been like? And is she a real character? Is she a real woman at that age, do you think?
Look, she's definitely a real woman because she's got plenty of flaws. I mean, she's so overcome. The emotional centre of this book is really that triangle between Eleanor, Michael and Anna. And it's the relationship between the three of them that really drives the book. And you see Anna overcome at times with jealousy for that marriage and the way she smashes all their plates. And you see her overcome with grief for her children, the way she, steals that poppy juice and completely gets off on it. So you see quite a lot of flaws. She ignores Afra, the pain and suffering of her stepmother, because it's quite inconvenient for her to think of it. So she's certainly got flaws. So in that respect, she's not the perfect person, but is somebody of her. She's never been outside this village, yet she sees more clearly than anyone else there exactly what's going on, exactly what's likely to be the cause of it. And, the ending where she ends up in a Muslim country as a sort of a healer for women. I mean, what do you think?
I don't know.
You've got the front part of this book that seems to me to be so based in historical fact, even if the character of Anna allows us a modern view of that, because we couldn't see it if we didn't have a modern pair of eyes looking at it for us. And then you have this ending, and I'm completely not a historian, I've got no evidence of this, but I reckon that's fairly unlikely. That she's plucked out and makes a life for herself in this harem.
I guess what's interesting, because we were talking a little bit about this before, and what's interesting about the ending is that this is Geraldine Brooks's first novel, and she worked as a war correspondent before for years throughout the Middle East. And what comes through for me in this novel is the gore. Is very visceral as a writer. Like, I was like, whoa, you've got to... I don't know if I could write that. I find it difficult to read. But it's obviously something that she's actually come across a lot in life.
Because she's seen a lot of dead bodies. She's seen decomposing bodies. She's got this kind of experience. So she's the kind of person who knows what they look like. And
she ends up in the Middle East again in the end.
Yeah, there you go.
So maybe it was just... I mean, on a sort of textural level, there is that beautiful movement from green to yellow. Like, it's pretty as an ending.
Yeah, it is.
But I don't know about believable too.
Yeah, but there's something, she goes through a lot, She loses her 2 children, she loses her husband, she loses perhaps her next husband, she loses her best friend. She has this horrible period in this time. I mean, who's going to wish that she doesn't have a happy ending in a nice harem in the Middle East? Not me.
A happy ending in a nice harem.
What's wrong with that?
That's going to go down well. Yeah, there's... The other big theme that came out for me in the novel is the relationship between Anna and science and Anna and nature as well. There's a very visceral feeling of nature in the book, and a very visceral feeling of science too. That we talked about just earlier. That there's a real feel that Anna might be a little bit ahead of her time there, and that the Gaudis and what Anna's doing is seen very much as witchcraft within the construct of that field. And I wonder, when Geraldine Brooks went to write this novel, if that's a deliberate way to comment on how we still see science as witchcraft too, and if that's maybe part of what we do with historical novels, is look at the present through the historical past, since it's obviously not. So I thought, could you talk a little bit to that idea of fiction and all?
That also comes back to the idea of how Anna is really the perfect narrator to give us a view of that world. Because if our narrator was like all the other villagers who saw this thing as a supernatural thing, and there would be no rational reason for her to comment on them. There would be nothing unusual about that. But because Anna is quite the enlightened one, it allows us to have a sort of a modern view into this book. It allows us to watch her slow awakening and watch as things really change around her. And it's the same kind of change that you see the way she reacts with the character of Michael, because at the beginning she thinks Michael is absolute, God on earth. And she actually says, I wrote down, at the very beginning when she's looking after him, when he's shut up in the very beginning, which of course is well into the story, he's shut up in the rectory, he's not eating, his wife is dead. She's looking after him, making him pies and cutting up bits of apple to try and tempt him to eat something. She says she's doing it for Eleanor. I tell myself I do it for her. Why else would I do it after all? I mean, there's a strong bond there that's got nothing to do with Eleanor, really. She's being the classic unreliable narrator. And it's only at the end, actually very close to the end, 281, that she realises he's kind of a creep. So, and at that point she says, suddenly his whole person was repulsive to me. So you have this awakening moment, and that's the same awakening moment that's replicated the way she sees her relationship with God, the way she sees her relationship with the other people in the village. It's so important that she's a shepherd, I think, for this book, that she has an understanding of the ebbs and flows of nature, and that how animals are cared for and the diseases that animals get, and that enables her to have an access into this illness in a way that any other person with any other job wouldn't have.
Yeah.
So all these things sort of add up to give her a unique viewpoint.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you call Anna an unreliable narrator, because before you said that, I haven't really thought of her that way. I sort of thought of her as a fairly straight-up person. And when it came to that Michael reveal scene, and it turns out he's... I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on stage. I assume I'm not, so I'm not going to. But when it came to that point, I was like, I sort of almost lost my faith in the novel a little bit.
Oh, really?
But it makes a lot more sense through that construct of...
Yeah, I thought she was
narrator.
kind of so, she's such a faithful servant so much of the way through, like continually thinking that these people are above her because they can read and because they're, gentry or whatever.
Yeah.
That you kind of see that she's seeing the world through this class structure, and maybe, when she starts to see that the Bradfords are really not very nice people, you sort of almost see that class structure falling away before her eyes.
I mean, everybody is sort of a not very nice person in this novel, though.
There's not so many nice people in this book, is there?
The men especially, and with that modern rereading too, I wonder, how do you feel about the portrayal of the men in this? Like, normally we talk about portrayal of women in novels, but how do you feel about the portrayal of men in this novel?
Look, by my reckoning, you have... there's Michael, clearly, creep already established. Josiah, her father, not such a good piece of work. George Vickers, the poor tailor, who was a very nice guy but unfortunately killed the whole village, so, you can't really think too highly of him. And then really there's just Colonel Bradford who hightails it out of there and then tries to kill his wife and the newborn daughter and all that kind of thing. So you kind of... But on the other hand, a lot of the women aren't very nice either. You look at Afra, you look at all the villagers. The only other person who's really gets, other than Eleanor, who gets any good press is that little Mary Wickford, the little Puritan girl who has the mind. So yes, the guys get a bit of a short shaft, but so does a lot of other people. Like it's more the good people are rarer.
Yeah. We will open up in a little bit for your questions, so do keep them in mind. I was going to ask you, since a lot of the people in this room will be going to write about the book, in your own work as a reviewer and a writer, how do you approach writing about books? What's your first step?
It's hard. The hardest thing is to divorce your own emotions from it, because it's very difficult to write in an analytical and critical and questioning way about something that you either adore, like I adore it so much I can't bear to hear a word of criticism, or something that you hate so much you have trouble engaging with it. So I think the first thing to do is try and put your emotional response to one side, and sort of see yourself, I say this sometimes. When I was buying my first house, I was very young, in my 20s, and my father was a builder, and he came around and I'm kind of, oh my God, look at the polished floorboards, oh look, there's a walk-in robe, and he was like, feel that joist, that's rotten, look underneath here, see that white powder, that's termites. So rather than falling in love with the appearance of something or your emotional response to something, I want to encourage you to sort of crawl under the floorboards and kind of look up and think, what is actually going on here? What are the writing craft things you can see? What is it trying to mean underneath? Try and pull it apart like you're autopsying it, rather than sort of just feeling an emotional response to it.
Yeah. When you crawled under the boards and looked up at it through the Year of Wonders, what were the craft elements that really stood out for you?
Especially the language, because I found it's so beautiful and so accessible. The novelist David Mitchell talks about this a lot. He writes often historical fiction, and he says you can't actually, even if you do all the research in the world, you can't actually duplicate the language of that earlier time, because it's not fun to read, it's painful to read, and readers do not want to read something that sounds like that. So he develops a method that he calls, I thought this was fantastic, old-time-ese, I think he calls it, which means he gives it a certain cadence so that it sounds not of this time, and there's little hints that show it's of an earlier time, but it's not, genuinely how they speak. So there's an enormous skill that goes into that, and there's an enormous amount of research, yet the book is not clogged up with research. And I think that's a real danger with historical fiction that the people do so much research on a time and they know so much about it, they just can't wait to tell you everything about it, from what they have to breakfast to everything. But there's none of that here. It's a very natural response of an extraordinary woman seeing the world through her eyes. So the point of view is fantastic. The character of Anna is fantastic. The way Brooks has crafted this unique individual specifically so we can see what life is like in that village. It's like she's given us a special key to the hearts and minds of these people and what's going on. I think that's just remarkable.
What strikes me a little bit about this book is the time frame too, like setting it over 1 year really gets to speed things up. Like there's a real sense of, obviously everyone's dying, which gives you a bit of a sense of urgency too, but there's a sense of seasonal change and of much tighter time frames that I think is sort of modern in the ways that, like, Hilary Mantel, who wrote Wolf Hall, which is this massive tome about a period just previous to this, it's so slow. I mean, it's great, it's a wonderful book, I loved it, but there's a real sense that she's trying to give you time.
But it is. It's historical fiction with the boring bits cut out, you know, and that's what really, and some of those weight of details is what makes historical fiction difficult to read because of the sheer size of it.
Yeah, yep. The feeling of seasons, I think, is beautiful in this book.
It's so clever. It's just so clever because it also, I mean, there's something. I mean, a book about the plague where 80% of the people in a village die, it's kind of a downer, you know?
Just a little bit.
So part of the idea that these are seasonal changes, that there is a time for winter and then there's a time again for spring, is almost a consoling thought. I think there's a lot of compassion in Brooks as a writer, that she has come across this format that somehow, and as you were saying earlier, the connection between the natural world and what's going on in the book, that you get the idea that, you know, it's a very unpleasant thing, but it is part of the natural world. It's not a supernatural curse placed on anybody. There will be a time for spring, and sure enough, the village does recover from it.
Yeah. Interestingly, too, Brooks herself is a huge environmentalist. She did a very interesting Boyer lecture last year, which I recommend to all of you as students, on the idea of home, and also, but like, she's a big climate change activist and environmental activist, and I think that sort of nature is part of herself as well. It's very visceral to a lot of her writing. Yep. And seasonal change as well, which again makes me wonder about that construct between science and nature in the book, that maybe she isn't going to be, if she was writing modern fiction, maybe she wouldn't be quite so embracing of science.
But
I don't know.
Well, that's true, but you know, what we see as nature in the book, like the herbal medicines and things like that, at that time they saw as pretty much cutting edge, you know,
technology.
That was high tech, making, you know, opium or whatever it was out of the poppies. You know, that was as high tech as you went. So in this book there's a blurring between those areas of science and nature, and I suppose part of the point of that you're making, Ruby, is that now there is a big gap between science and nature, whereas back then it wasn't so big.
Or at least between technology and science and nature.
Sure.
Since we've gone under the floorboards and looked at what's beautiful, maybe you could show us a little bit of the cracks too. Is there something that you took away as...
Yeah, well, I suppose the thing that does pull you up about the book, as I mentioned earlier, is the ending. Because she's gone to such trouble to make 280-something pages of incredibly, as you said, visceral, researched, based on a real village in a real time. And whether you find the character of Anna a construction to allow us to see that world or not, it's based in something solid. You get the feeling it's based in something solid. And the ending, I don't know if that's based in something solid or it just makes me feel good. That's fine too. But it's kind of a different style. Stylistically it's different. Tonally it's different.
She's suddenly got 2 kids.
Yes, I have two kids, no husband to worry about, good beauty. So she's living in a harem where she has she doesn't have to sleep with the head of the harem, and she's practicing medicine, and things could not really have turned out better. That's a slightly uncomfortable fit. But in the defence even of that ending is, without that ending, is that book just going to be too oppressive for the modern soul? I mean, there's something again, compassionate. I come back to the word compassionate about this book, about the idea of the seasons, the idea of the natural world, and the idea of, after all that she's been through, that she's lifted out of that.
And the nobility of them actually closing themselves off too. And I wonder if that would happen
the courage
today, like the degree to which, without some sort of crazy vengeful God, that people would actually, I don't know, stand back and...
They thought they were doing the right thing. So, there's an enormous amount of courage involved in that.
Courage aside, the thing that I think stood out for me is one of the cracks was everybody was just so unlikable. I wonder how necessary that is. Like, I just sort of wanted to... I got the feeling that as a narrator, Anna was just... I mean... Is it Anna who's unable to find pleasure in other people's company, or is it...
Well, this is the vital thing to remember about first-person narrators, is you are only ever seeing everybody else through their eyes. So perhaps the other characters are not as bad as she paints them. Perhaps for some reason that's the way she sees them. What does that say about her character, rather about their characters? So with first-person narrators, you have to just be a little bit... not suspicious, but just a little bit wary. It's like somebody you don't know is telling you something about somebody else. So you just have to go, okay, let's just see how that pans out.
I mean, even with Michael's reveal as well, when I went back, because I read this first... maybe 6 months ago when I'd read a lot of her other work, and I was going through a big binge on Geraldine books. And even with Michael's reveal, when I went back and reread just that little section, I found that he's not actually that horrible. Like, he is saying that he still loves her, and he is saying that he's made a mistake, and that he's... I don't know if he's like redeemable, but he's not that horrible. And I wondered then at her reaction to it, reading that second time and being like, "Whoa, you're a bit."
But I think part of the reason of that reaction is that she realises she's betrayed Eleanor. So she's really just as mad with herself. I mean, she slept with her best friend's husband. It's not such a good thing. So I think a lot of that anger that she directs at Michael is really it's guilt that she's feeling herself. She's got to stick it somewhere, so she points it at him, I suppose.
We'll be opening to questions from you guys now before we keep on talking about sleeping with your best friend's husband. Is there anyone in the audience who'd like to ask a question? Don't be shy. There you go. There's a hand going up.
So you didn't like the ending. How would you have ended the book?
Oh, well, see... That's a really great question, because as much as I see that the ending does not sit necessarily with the rest of the book, I think I would have done, well, I don't know, I'm no Geraldine Brooks, but I think I would have kept the same intention which is to balance the incredible grief with joy at the end. So I suppose there's two sides to that argument. Is consistency? No, it's not consistent. Plausibility? Probably not. But sometimes in fiction it's a question of balance, and if something is all... you see also this in the best comedies, you see it in the best horror films, that what you do is you crank up the horror and then you let people have a rest, and then you crank up the horror again, you let people have a rest. So I think tonally it's a good idea to have a release of that grief and of that pain at the end. So I might not have sent it to... Where does she go? Omar or something?
Oman.
Iran, I think it... Yeah, okay.
Oman or Iran, depending on the spelling.
Oh, right, okay. Oman. But I think the intention to release that pressure of that grief is probably the right one. But I love happy endings. I've got happy endings in both my books.
And plausibility aside there too, there was that idea of like colour change that she did very skillfully too, that we mentioned before, to moving landscapes for release, which is a beautiful technique of getting you away from that sort of dank valley and that enclosed feeling to this dryness and heat and space that, it's beautiful.
Regarding the ending, I thought she ended up on the Barbary Coast, which is in North Africa, which is sort of virtually straight down from Spain. And with the development in many Muslim countries, they may have been ahead of England in regards to the practice of medicine.
Very much.
So I see it as a kind of a connection that she progresses her knowledge by going to this country. I don't think she really ended up in the Middle East. I think it was the northwest corner of Africa. But do you see that connection, that she could be furthering her medical knowledge?
Oh, definitely. And
that?
in fact, I think she says that she specifically went to hunt out the author of one of the books she found in Eleanor's library, one of her books. So it was obviously someone whose work she had enormous respect for, and she'd gone to the trouble to sort of find him. So it is part of her path of growth, you know, with these two children.
I guess the plausibility issue there isn't so much where she ends up, it's the idea of a single white woman with 2 children travelling on her own at that period of time with no funds in such a liberated, happy way. But that said, there's beautiful elements to that ending too. So, yeah.
There's a lovely fictional balance to that ending. You know, it gives a turning point to the book, and it gives light and shade to her life. So, you know, it's like a painting in that respect. You know.
Come on, Year 12s, we know you're out there with questions. Yeah, there we go.
Earlier on you were talking about that the men in the novel weren't very nice. Do you think that the character of Brand could have been maybe a glimmer of hope, like a symbol of hope for the men in the novel?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because he was young, you know, younger than the rest. Yeah,
Nice
maybe
call.
future generations might came up a bit better. I think that's a good point. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What's the most significant scene in the book?
I did warn you to get one
Yeah,
first.
that's a good question. What do you think?
That's cheating. I'm just here to gee, what's the most significant? Well, I suppose since I haven't reread it closely, I'm trying to think of what springs out at me, having left a period of time away from it. When I sat down to think, you've really put me on the spot.
A few things jumped out at me. I suppose the one scene that jumped out at me was the scene where Eleanor confesses her past to Anna, where she actually talks about how she came to be married to Michael, you know, what a sinner she was in reality, and why they didn't have children. Not that because they weren't having sex, but why she couldn't have children. And so that was really... You know, one of the things about this book is that it's quite a graceful arc. Anna's change is not dramatic, really. There's a few points of little spikes, but it's really small things that change her mind. She changes her mind about this and then this, and it's accumulated weight of little events that make her the person that she is by the end. But that scene is quite dramatic in the context of that gentle arc, because all the shackles fall off her eyes and she suddenly sees, you know, this woman that she's put on a pedestal has flaws like everybody else, and despite the pain and humiliation she's undergone, still has such empathy for people, and I think that's quite a moving scene.
Yeah. Sitting here thinking about it, that scene that I went back to reread before I came here today, the scene between Michael and Eleanor, which is another reveal, I obviously went back to reread it for a reason, because it stood out for me from the book. But then when I reflect on it and sit now, the first scene that sort of jumped into my head on an image and a movement feeling was actually the scene where Anna is going through withdrawals from the puppy. In the Gaudi's little hut. And I think on a lot of levels, for me personally, and I think this is part of what you do when you do analysis too, you move away from the book and you look at the book, and then you also analyse your own emotions in regard to that book and why you felt what you felt, and then bring it back to the text in that way. And for me personally, that I found obviously that scene really moving, but also I think I found it moving because it shows Anna's strength in a way that a lot of the other scenes she's very reactive and judgmental with, whereas that is actually her own sort of strength moving through that addiction. And I sort of felt that was, I think that's probably quite a meaningful scene within this construct of her character. But yeah.
That's a good question.
Just quickly, maybe on that question too, before we take one, there's one down the front here as well, and maybe one up the back from the Year 12s after that. But on the idea of writing about books, there's a beautiful Virginia Woolf quote, which I'm going to mash now, but I'll bring the full quote to the next text in the city, which is that it's not important that I tell you what I feel, but only that I show you how I got to what I think.
Yeah, right.
Which is a very analytical sort of good thing to remember when they're coming up. Yep, up the back. Is it on?
Yeah. What do you think are the small steps that made her think that the plague was more about science, not about religion? Like,
yeah, that's a good point as well, isn't it? What are the actual moments? It's kind of, I think part of it comes from how. I think the seeds for this are sowed at the very beginning when George says, "Burn all my things." And so there's a little hint that maybe he has a suspicion that it's something concrete that can be burnt rather than something that descends from the heaven. And I think that idea rests with her for a little while because she thinks about it, and she does burn the dress that he made for her, and she tells everybody to burn them, but none of them do because they're all poor people, and new clothes are an incredible investment, and they have no grasp of it. So I think the seed is laid by George when he says burn everything, and then as she watches it spread, it's a combination of watching it spread, what George said, and her experience with dealing with the animals. I think that really sort of kicks it off.
Yeah, there are all those elements coming through. Yeah, I don't know if I could pinpoint any particular places more aptly than that. I think it's very much a sort of a tick, tick, tick process. And her idea of nature and dealing with the animals, I think, is really fundamental to all of that. There's a passage where she starts going, I can't remember the page number, but that says, if we could simply work upon it as a farmer might toil to rid his field of unwanted tear, knowing that when we found the tools and methods and resolve, we would free ourselves, no matter if we were a village of sinners or a host of saints. That idea that she's seeing the methodology of farming and that relentless construct. So I think there's those two elements too. There was just a question from this lady here in the green top in the front.
Yes, I'd just like you to comment on the actual structure of the novel, the way in which the plague year is sandwiched between the beginning and the end. Why do you think Brooks did that?
Well, this is only 2001, and it's a very popular technique now to have, a little glimpse of the ending or near the ending, and then the whole story, and then catching up with it, 2/3 of the way through. It gives a symmetry to the book because you have this effectively, a bit of a prologue before things start happening. You have the ending, which is almost like an epilogue. So it gives a symmetry to the shape of it, and that's something that obviously she's interested, the way she's spread it over a year. There's a modern feeling about novels that you shouldn't make people wait for the most exciting part. You shouldn't, have a slow beginning, slow rise, to something interesting happens. You should start with something interesting. And the way this has happened, because you're starting with 2/3 of the way through, she uses all these foreshadowing techniques. So she says things like, on page 6 even, she says she has trouble walking through the village and just nodding at people after all we've been through together. So, of course, the reader doesn't know at that point what they've all been through together. She says there's a wonderful sentence, again, on early on, if there's one thing I can't stand anymore, it's the scent of a rotting apple. So all these kind of things that she's able to use foreshadowing to make the reader think, well, what does that mean? Well, what does that mean? So little hints. Whereas if it was actually starting from the beginning and she didn't know what was happening, you wouldn't be able to use this as a technique to sort of draw people in. So I think it's a combination of fashion, novel writing. Novels go through fashions like anything else. The symmetry with almost a prologue and the epilogue, and the ability to use foreshadowing at the beginning.
It's an interesting point too about to raise at this time about the historical novel as a product of modernity too, that you are required a lot as writers now to write pot boilers because you're competing with YouTube. So the idea that books give you a space for reflection, you're allowed a reflective paragraph, but a lot of the time it's quick, where's the next pot point? Run.
You're allowed to be reflective provided you get people in, the idea is. So the modern thinking is you should start at a moment of change, start at the time when something happens, and then you go back and explain how you got there. So that's kind of a more modern feeling about novel writing.
And keeping in mind that this is a debut book as well, I think she gets a lot less fast-paced as she goes on through the books. They definitely become longer and more reflective, and maybe that's something that writers have to get to Hilary Mantel's stage before they can write
because
something
then,
that's slow.
By the time you're as famous as Hilary Mantel, your editors are too scared to say anything to you.
Witness the Harry Potter series.
That's right. It gets longer and longer with more adverbs the longer you go.
Questions from at the back? Was there a hand Thank you. There we go.
I was just wondering, going back to Michael, I was just wondering about Anna and, if she really truly loved him at any point in time, or just more the image of Michael and how she seeks out for those men to admire, sort of.
Well, there's a lot of things to sort of weed out in that question, and that relates partly also to the earlier discussion about the quality of the men around her. Like, compared to her father, Michael was a fantastic kind of guy, but how much of that, the feeling that she has for him at the beginning, is because of the envy that she has for Eleanor's life, really, Eleanor's whole life. And part of that falls away when she sees the pain and humiliation and sin that Eleanor has suffered. So part of that reason for Michael has gone. But, the idea of, really truly loved, I don't even know if that meant the same thing in 1665 as it would have meant today. She married Sam because he asked, and Afra told her father that, if he didn't marry her off, somebody worse might come along. And she was going to marry George because he was good with her children. So I think there's a completely different expectation for what love was back then.
Yeah, and on a modern reading too, I think Anna's very young. It's important to keep her incredible youth in mind in that construct too. And what she falls in love with isn't actually Michael so much as the relationship that Michael has, and she falls in love with the couple essentially. Like when I was reading it, I was wondering if she was going to end up with Eleanor, and I was like, well, that's an interesting read. Like it's an interesting thing to do, Geraldine. So what she falls in love with and is wrong about, and I think that's part of the idea of the book too, on an emotional level, which we haven't really talked about, is the idea of being wrong about falling in love too. That you do fall in love with something, and then
for other reasons, for reasons because compared to your father, he's a great guy, or compared to your first husband, he's a great guy, or when your best friend is with him, it looks like the perfect relationship from the outside. Like all these things add into her feelings for him. That's a good question.
Would you argue that the story is more plot-driven or character-driven?
Well, I have a very definite opinion about this, that I really think there's no difference. I really think plot-driven and character-driven are two sides of the same coin. So even if you look at the most plot-driven stories, it's all because of a flaw in the protagonist that makes that story come alive. And if you look at the most character-driven stories, it's because those characters are in extraordinary situations that enable their character to be revealed. So it just depends, really. It's almost a marketing kind of decision in a lot of ways. If you look at, I sometimes talk about Lord of the Rings in this context because everyone knows what I'm talking about. So, you say that might be perfectly categorised as a plot-driven story, but it only works because Frodo is this tall and he has to climb this enormous mountain. So if he was a normal-sized person, climbing a mountain is not a big deal. So it doesn't matter which idea came first. If the writer thinks about the plot first and goes, I know I'm going to have someone climb this incredibly tall mountain, therefore I'll make him 3 feet tall, or the character came first. I've got an idea for a character who's 3 feet tall. I know I'll make him climb the highest mountain. So the plot has to be designed to show the character, and the characters have to be designed to make the plot more challenging. And another good example of this is Jaws, because I'll talk about that again because everyone knows what I'm talking about. That really, the most powerful part of that is that Sheriff Brody, who's the protagonist of Jaws, I don't know if you remember, it's probably been ages since you've seen the film, Ruby, but he's terrified of the water. Do you remember that? So it doesn't matter in the mind of the writer if the character comes first. I know, I've got a great idea for a sheriff who's terrified of the water, and then you think, I know, I'll make him sheriff of a ski field. Like, it just doesn't happen like that. If you get the character first who's scared of the water, you put him on the water. Give him the biggest challenge on the water you can think of. Or reverse, I know, I've got a great idea for a giant shark, therefore my character will be someone who's scared of the water. So it's the flip of each other. The plot is designed to show the character in its most raw sense, and the characters are designed to highlight the difficulties of the plot.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, Frodo could always have gone home and there wouldn't have been a book anymore, and just like Anna could have left the village, but what sort of defines it, and maybe when you're thinking on an analytic level too, is the reactions between the two.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's sort of like how the character reacts to plot and how they bounce off and weave in with each other. Yep. And on the sad note of Frodo going home, it is now time for us all to go home. I want to remind you that next week we've got Text in the City. We're doing the wonderfully edited Growing Up Asian in Australia by Alice Pung, which is a great book. But please join me now in thanking the wonderful Toni Jordan. Thank you, Toni.